Today we will answer a major question that I've asked before, which will undoubtedly interest many of you. Did the Vikings who came to settle in Normandy become Franks? But what happened for the Scandinavians, whom the Frankish ecclesiastics described as pagans and looters? That many things distinguished, not to mention oppose? Could the Franks settle in Normandy with the king's approval? And what happened next? Can William the Conqueror thus be considered a Frankish noble, or should he be considered a Scandinavian? What was Roland's logic once Normandy was entrusted to him? In summary, we will respond to these intriguing questions together, drawing upon the work of historians as we usually do. In terms of terminology, as you may already know, and as indicated by the author Pierre Baudouin, the term Viking was not used in the same way as we do by contemporaries being the people who lived in those times. These, especially the Franks and the Anglo-Saxons, preferred the term pagan, Danish, or Norman. So it's no coincidence that today we talk about Normandy and not Vikingi. The term Viking is now commonly used to refer to the Scandinavians who participated in maritime expeditions from the 8th to the 11th century. That's why I'll discuss the Vikings instead of the Normans when talking about the Scandinavians. They came to confuse the rest of Europe, but they did not settle in what is today the Normandy region, just to keep all of this clear for you. The Viking raids in the west likely started in 787 or 789 and first head towards the British Isles. The first recorded Viking raid on Frankish territory occurred in 799. In Vendée, Charlemagne's reaction, Emperor of the Franks, from the following year, does not wait. He understands the threat. He reinforces the Frankish coastal defenses and forms fleets to counter the attacks. This organization will generally hold up and do the job, although it won't prevent the enormous pressure a Danish king will manage to exert. Godfred on the Frise. In 810, in response to the Carolingian push in Saxony, Charlemagne dies in 814. However, his defense system, having proven effective, will keep the Vikings at bay until around 830 in the North Sea and 840 on the Atlantic coast. The Frankish territories were weakened and disorganized by political instability caused by dynastic quarrels. Rob from the channel History with a Big H explains it well in one of his videos. The link is in the description. Will start to become an interesting target for the Vikings. The raids on France intensify. Dorosta in Friesland is looted annually from 834 to 837. Rouen is burned in 841. Nantes is hit in 843, followed by Paris's first attack in 845. Subsequently, the entire Seine Valley is targeted from 851 to 853. Tours followed in 853, then Orleans in 854. This non-exhaustive list continues to expand, peaking between 856 and 861. The Frankish territories are under immense and nearly intolerable pressure. Vikings who aim to loot, trade, and search for tribes. Despite minor territorial concessions in Frisia, the Danes lacked a real foothold in Carolingian territory at that time. After a brief respite, the Nordic pressure will resume more strongly in the 870s, with the climax being the Siege of Paris from 885 to 887. What does our friend Rome tell us about this? Charles the Fat, who will essentially drop his trousers in front of the Vikings when he arrives in the vicinity of Paris in order to lift the siege. He's going to lose big, and that's an understatement. And as a result, he becomes Charles the, since he loses big. No, Charles the Fat ends up being deposed in West Francia and replaced by Odo, who defended Paris against the Vikings. The turbulent late 9th century likely sees the first Scandinavian settlers at the Seine's mouth. According to Pierre Baudouin, with the tacit agreement of the Frankish authorities. Perhaps due to the lack of consensus on the subject, a certain Roland was part of it, whom we will now discuss. Jean Renaud agrees with this, also indicating that the king of Western Francia is trying as early as 897 to negotiate with what they call the Vikings of the Seine. However, this possible tolerance towards the few Scandinavian colonies established at the mouths of the Seine lead with unclear origins emerges from the 10th century onwards, shattering previous norms, and lead bands of Viking raiders in the region, before going to break their teeth on Chartres in 911. In response to this, Charles the Simple, who ascended to the throne of the Western Franks following Eudes, unsurprisingly seeks to solve the Viking problem, since the latter continued to exert unbearable pressure on his territory. After Roland suffers a severe defeat without his band being destroyed, he willingly turns to his opponent and begins negotiations. This led to the Saint-Clair-sur-Hepte agreement, a decisive event for our topic today. Saint-Clair-sur-Hepte is now a charming commune. This agreement, with unknown terms, involved a territorial cession, including the area between the Hepte and the sea, with Rouen and the Lower Seine, in exchange for something undisclosed. Roland was baptized as a Christian, becoming the king's faithful subject while retaining full ownership of his lands, which he could pass on to his heirs, and committed to ensuring the tutela regni, the protection of the kingdom. This was primarily aimed at deterring Scandinavian bands that might be tempted to sail up the Seine, which he and his successors would indeed do. As an aside, here's a brief anecdote that will likely interest fans of the Viking series, which, it must be noted, is not a documentary. According to both historians Baudouin and Bouet, it seems that according to this treaty, it was indeed planned that Rollo would marry a girl of royal blood, a certain Gisla. However, this element was long disputed, as there was no trace, according to its authors, of any daughter to Charles. The Simple thus made this clause, barely mentioned by some Norman chroniclers, potentially fanciful, and with the aim of presenting Rollo in a particularly favorable light. However, recent studies, also confirmed by Jean Renaud, who attributes 6 daughters to Charles the Simple, estimate that in 911, the King of Francia did indeed have a daughter named Gisla, but she was only a young child at the time of the agreement, and who would have died before reaching adulthood, and therefore before the marriage could take place. The series depicts the marriage consummation with a touch of malice, which would therefore explain this gray area and the doubt that still exists on the subject. As I mentioned before, we don't have the precise terms of the agreement. Nonetheless, this agreement gave birth to Normandy, the most enduring political foundation created by the Scandinavians in the West. The cession of a territory to Rollo, accompanied by a conversion clause intended for him and his companions, as well as the loyalty he owed to the Carolingian sovereigns, extended in many ways an established Frankish practice. This, along with other factors we'll explore, will result in genuine political success. Normans specifically enabled by what can be called the Normans' assimilation to their Frankish surroundings. As summarized by Pierre Baudouin and Trevor Rowley, the political success of the Normans lies largely in the deliberate choice of integration into the Frankish environment in which they evolved. Initiated by the first Norman counts of Rouen, Baudouin also believes that there were initial contacts as early as the end of the 9th century. Roland and his successors quickly and voluntarily assimilate into the Frankish world, whether administratively or culturally. This included the power networks within the Kingdom of West Francia. The Normans' desire to integrate and assimilate into Frankish society was crucial for the principality's future. The counts and later dukes of Normandy, while borrowing from Scandinavian rights and exercising power, modeled their state after the Frankish system. The Normans' conversion led to the creation of a hybrid culture. Jean Renaud thus believes that the first generation of Normans was of mixed faith, that is, mixing Christian and Scandinavian beliefs. Many so-called pagan traditions were practiced among them, some of which would persist for a while. In parallel, and this also from Roland, the Norman leaders have, from a matrimonial point of view, quickly associated with the Frankish nobility, although this was not systematic. Roland would later marry Popa, the kidnapped daughter of a Frankish nobleman from Bayeux in the late 9th century, and was initially his concubine. In essence, a kind of concubine or second wife in the Scandinavian law of the time, with whom he had a son who was William of Normandy, known as William Longsword, who subsequently strengthened his territory. and was indeed a fervent Christian who in turn married a Frankish woman, but this time, according to Frankish traditions, a certain Lutgard. According to Trevor Rowley, William accelerated the integration of Frankish practices at the Norman court, even initiating the construction of a castle in the Frankish town of Fécamp. From all this, logically and quickly, during the 10th century, a culture that will be both Scandinavian and Frankish will appear among the Normans and their descendants. Not without friction, as the Normans, the most reluctant to this cultural, religious, and social integration, will rise up several times. This will especially interest all the Normans watching me. Baudouin claims that the Scandinavian settlement did not appear to disrupt the population structures or significantly change the indigenous rural communities of the territory. Rowley agrees in this sense, indicating that, from a cultural point of view, I quote that there is no doubt that the majority of the Norman population remained Frankish. Renaud, for his part, summarizes all of this as follows, I quote, "There was no segregation between the old habitat and the new. The Scandinavians have melted into the pre-existing mold." Historians consider it clear and unambiguous. The Normandy Vikings sought to assimilate into their immediate environment from the start. From an archaeological point of view, this is confirmed. To advance this, I rely on elements and synthesis work shared by my friend Excavator, a talented archaeology popularizer from the Herodotus label. The archaeological evidence of Viking colonization before 911 AD is relatively scarce. The archaeological elements demonstrating a potential Scandinavianization. Records of Normandy after 911 following the treaty are nearly non-existent. And why? Well, quite simply, as we have seen, because it seems that the Normans have on the one hand settled in pre-existing places. This matches the viewpoint of the historians we have read together. They rebuilt the buildings they had destroyed decades earlier in their original Roman style, as affirmed by Renaud. It is also important to keep in mind that the Vikings, then the Normans, were, on the scale of the territory, fundamentally not very numerous. Finishing explaining all this? All that being said, it is of course not a question of saying that the Vikings and then the Normans had no impact or minimal impact on present-day Normandy. This is clearly not true. In fact, experts on the subject do not really agree on the matter. What is the share of Scandinavian culture and what is the share of Frankish culture in the Norman history of the 10th century? One thing is certain, however, the Normans, who only make up a part of the population of the territory, as you can see on the map of the Scandinavian colonization of Normandy on the screen, truly belong to both. Since, while perfectly integrating into the Frankish model, there are still strong ties with Scandinavia, both commercial, cultural, and political. It's at the beginning of the 11th century that Normans well integrated into their Frankish environment will move even further away from their Scandinavian origins, for complex reasons, and notably the hostility of the Norman court towards the Danish conquest of England, first led by Sven Forkbeard, king of the Danes, then by his son Knut, who succeeds him, causing the flight of the then King of England, Athelred, known as the Unready, who takes refuge in Normandy. This, combined with the appeal of Italian expansion to some Norman elites, such as the Hauteville, contributed to the situation. A likely shift in Scandinavian trade towards other regions further weakens the connection that may have existed between Normandy and Scandinavia. Even as the Normans, settled there for a century now, are then fully part of Christian Europe. So can we say that a few decades later, William II of Normandy, known as William the Conqueror, was ultimately more of a Frank than a Viking? Without a doubt, yes. Therefore, is it possible to say that the Vikings of Normandy, the Normans, became Franks? The answer appears to be yes, as the Norman identity of the time fully belongs, albeit with its own peculiarities. Of course you understood, I have no doubt, to the Frankish cultural sphere. In fact, if the Bayeux Tapestry, representing the conquest of England by William, pits the Franks. To the English, the Franks were like the Anglo-Saxons or the French to them, broadly speaking. Translations indicate that the 11th century Normans simply and correctly identified themselves as Franks. Moreover, per Pierre Baudouin, the regional Old French of Normandy at the time has only inherited around 150 words from Norse, mostly from the maritime vocabulary. In essence, Normandy is the legacy of Rollo and his Vikings, who gave rise to its dual nature, a swift and willing integration into their surroundings and the Frankish system, while integrating, where it made sense to them, Scandinavian cultural elements. Within roughly a century, the Normandy Vikings transformed into Franks. There remains a thorny question. Can a 21st century Norman claim to descend from the Vikings today? In this case, what is often understood by Vikings when the question is asked or the statement made? We're referring to the Scandinavians who settled in Normandy over 1,000 years ago. Is it clear now? From a cultural point of view, you've understood it. This doesn't make much sense given the particularly rapid assimilation of the Scandinavians, meaning that about a millennium ago, the Normans belonged to the Frankish cultural sphere, which would later become French. Based on your family history, it's possible that among your ancestors, you have descendants of Gallo-Romans, Franks, or even Africans, Maghrebis, or Asians from a genealogical perspective. One or two Scandinavians from Normandy. Thank you for joining me for this new mini-documentary. I warmly invite you to visit the Indiegogo page of the Falconer's Gate Project so that we can be transported to Normandy in the 11th century, of which you are getting a small part of the atmosphere now with this mini-documentary. The link to the page is both in the description and also in the pinned comment. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already by clicking, of course, on the little bell. It's very important because otherwise you won't see it, or at least you'll have a lot less chance of seeing the next videos. To give a thumbs up if you liked the video and let us know in the comments. Did you anticipate the historian's perspective on this question? With that in mind, let's travel back a few centuries to meet Roland Roncevaux.